Hey, LifeBridge, we're going to take a couple moments today and talk about racial reconciliation with what's happening in our world around us. The death of George Floyd was just one of many, but it was unique in the sense that for a lot of people it really was a kind of a pivotal incident because people watched his tragic and his senseless murder on camera. And so for people who have been maybe somewhat disconnected from this conversation, the conversation about racial injustice over the years, this specific video has shifted it from something that's sort of theoretical to them for the first time. And so for people in our context, in a small town, this video has been a pivotal moment for a lot of people. We've been hearing from people this week who are really starting to think about things a little bit differently. And we wanted to take a minute to talk about racial injustice and talk about where do we fit into that conversation as a church. You know, it's a big issue and it's kind of an overwhelming issue when we look at how big of a problem it is. And it is important to point out the problem. It is important to protest. It is important to stand up and say, hey, this is a problem. But when the conversation shifts towards solutions and what can we actually do, it becomes a lot more difficult. And for us, and in the conversations we've had with individuals as well, people get overwhelmed when they think about, man, this is such a big problem, and I don't know where I fit into that. And so for the purpose of our conversation, we want to focus that conversation in a little bit more to what can we do and what should we do as a small local church in a small town, and as people who live in communities that aren't as affected by this, in the sense that while racism still does exist here, it's also a majority white place, and the harm that racism causes, we do find ourselves largely insulated from a lot of the time.
So as John said, we are gonna focus on our influence, our context, our church, our community, and we think that there's three really important things that we can and should do. And first and foremost is for us to denounce racism in every form, wherever we find it. And secondly, we want to open up communication and seek out stories that are different from our own and hear them. And then thirdly, we want to support financially those organizations that are well positioned to really make a difference on this issue.
Yeah, and that's stuff that we have prioritized. We're going to continue to do so. We did some of that in our Tough Topics conference recently, and we have tried to prioritize that, and that can be a challenge in our context, but that will continue to be an important issue for us, as we do think that racial reconciliation is something that we should play a part in, even if that is a small part. But really, the most important part of this conversation for us as a church is it comes down to what's happening in our individual hearts. How do we individually, as people who make up our church family, who make up our congregation, how do we think through these issues?
The first one that we wanted to ask, that we should be reflecting on, is our emotional response. How does our emotional response reflect the heart of God?
Yeah, I think as people who are somewhat detached from the issue itself, in the sense that we don't see it in front of us all the time, in our community and in our context, how do we still personalize and humanize the issue? It doesn't hit super close to home, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't matter to us. So in our own thinking, are we minimizing it? Are we ignoring it, or kind of leaving it over there on purpose because we don't like how it makes us feel? Does it grieve our hearts the way that it grieves God's heart?
Yeah, I think that's the big question, is does it affect us simply because what happened is wrong? And we should grieve sin, we should grieve evil wherever we find it. And there's a lot of evil in the mix of this whole conversation right now. And I think that's where we should start, and that should grieve our hearts. And it should grieve our hearts initially just because of the evil that happened. And not so much, it shouldn't take a minor inconvenience for us to grieve that. When we hear of injustice, when we hear of death, when we hear of even rioting, looting, those things should grieve our hearts.
Yeah, the next question that I think is really important for us to reflect on is, for me, as I'm gathering new information, as I'm reading what's happening, as I'm following it on social media, as I'm processing through this, am I doing that with good motives, and am I doing that with clear thinking?
We all need to be aware of our confirmation bias. We all do this, we all are tempted to at least, so we need to be aware of if we are actually just looking for stories that agree with our current narrative or our current understanding of the situation. Instead, we need to broaden our perspective and look for those stories that challenge our perspectives. Most of us don't have experience in policing, so we don't know what it feels like to be in a situation where literally life and death are hanging in the balance. Most of us don't have experience being a minority living in a predominantly minority community and what that must be like, so we must seek out these stories.
Yeah, and I think the way that we have this tendency to put a narrative on an entire group of people. So we can look at a bad actor here and say that okay, so now all of these protesters are a part of a violent protest. Or you can look at some cops who did something that's terrible and say, okay, so this is how cops are, or whatever the case is. But we shouldn't minimize those things that are happening, and we shouldn't be okay with a few bad actors. That's not true at all. But we should be very careful about applying that to what's happening to the whole group, rather than holding the fact that that's happening in tension with the good things that are happening within those movements, within police officers and the work that they do within the Black community and the protesting that's happening right now as well.
Another important question for us to consider is, how would I respond if I were in that situation? This is an important question because it can be so easy for us, looking at the situation from afar, to judge and determine what is right and what is wrong without actually putting ourselves in that position of thinking through how would I respond in these types of situations. And if we do that, and we do that honestly, and we do it well, I think it can give us opportunities for grace and opportunities for understanding and empathy with those who are going through this.
Yeah, so if I was a Black person, how would I be responding right now? How would I be responding to the fact that I'd spent my entire life on the wrong side of a broken system? How would I respond to that? And it's fair to say that I don't know. You know, it's fair to ask the question, have I ever actually experienced anything that even compares to that? And I really haven't. So I don't know how I would respond. So it's difficult for me to judge someone else's response. Not that there's nothing that's been done that's wrong, but to look at it and say, I know I wouldn't have done that, is I think it's a little bit prideful maybe.
Alternatively, how would I respond if I were a police officer right now during these riots? It's hot outside. I'm wearing a ton of riot gear. I'm up late. I miss my family. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I'm not sleeping well. I haven't had time to eat because I'm out on the front line facing protesters all day in case if something does turn violent or go bad. I honestly can't say how I would respond in some of those situations because they're stressful. And not only that, but some individuals are cursing you, are saying things that are hurtful and constantly. So I think putting ourselves in these positions and trying to imagine what it must be like will give us a ton of grace and a ton of empathy to understand how people can respond the way that they do.
Yeah, after reflecting on those questions, I think it's good to come to the question that is the question that we've been hearing a lot of people asking this week, and that's, what should I do?
And we don't have any simple cookie cutter, one-size-fits-all solutions for this, but we'd really encourage you to just think through not only what your opinion should be, but how should you be communicating your opinion? To whom should you be communicating your opinion? Really kind of think through your circle of influence and how you can best leverage your relational equity to have these really important conversations that definitely need to be had.
Yeah, I think the thing that's challenged me as I've thought about this is, what am I going to be doing to pursue racial reconciliation next week once the world has moved on, right? Once social media has moved on, once the news has moved on to other things, are we still going to be doing this work and fighting for justice as a church and as individuals. So that might be about what you teach your kids. It might be about prioritizing certain relationships. It might be about what you're listening to and what you're reading and what you're learning. But it's going to go beyond. It's going to go beyond sort of the news cycle that we're in right now, and the problem's not going to be solved at the end of this. So I think it's a good way for us to reset our mind in terms of the boots on the ground work that we want to be a part of. What is that going to look like once the rest of the world has moved on and the local church is left to carry this issue forward in our small town context in the few small ways that we're called to do it? So with that in mind, we would ask you to prayerfully consider this, prayerfully go through these questions. There's more in the packet that we're including along with this video. There's resources, and we want to continue to move this conversation forward so that we can be a part, in however small a way that we are, be a part of racial reconciliation.